مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. معي أنا هدي العويس على نورث بريس. أعلنت وزارة الخزانة الأمريكية عن استثناءات خاصة مدتها 6 أشهر تخص بها كل التحويلات المالية المتعلقة بالأعمال الإنسانية. هذه التحويلات سيتم استثنائها من عقوبات قيصر. أتت هذه الاستثناءات بعد مطالبات إقليمية ودولية من الولايات المتحدة والدول الأوروبية بتسهيل مسألة إيصال المساعدات للشعب السوري بعد الزلزال المدمر الذي ضرب سوريا وتركيا. فهل هذه هي البداية لسياسة أمريكية جديدة تجاه سوريا؟ هذا ما نبحثه في حلقة اليوم، وضيوفي لهذه الحلقة هما السيدة ياسمين جمال، وهي المستشارة السابقة لوزارة الدفاع الأمريكية، تنضم إلينا من لندن. ابقوا معنا لمتابعة هذه الحلقة. أهلا وسهلا بك سيدة ياسمين. إذن استثناءات أعلنت عنها وزارة الخزانة الأمريكية بعد أيام من الزلزال المدمر الذي تأثرت به سوريا وتحديدا الشمال السوري. الخزانة الأمريكية تقول أن هذه الاستثناءات ستضمن لأي دولة تريد تقديم مساعدات لسوريا سواء لدمشق أو شمال غرب سوريا أنه لن تطالها أي من عقوبات قانون قيصر. هل هذه بداية لتغير الموقف الدولي تجاه ملف العقوبات؟ هل ترى اليوم الدول الغربية بأن العقوبات لم تكن مجدية في تغيير النظام أو تغيير سلوك النظام، وها هي العقوبات تضر بالسوريين، تضر بالمدنيين أكثر من غيرهم؟
First of all, hi, thank you so much for having me. And that's a great question. I think that's a question on a lot of people's minds. Unfortunately, I don't, well, not unfortunately, actually, the answer is probably no. And I'll tell you why. Two main reasons, basically. And in order to understand this question, I think one has to understand the larger topic of US sanctions on Syria. So the US sanctions on Syria basically pertain to regime officials, pertain to the government, and pertain to foreign entities that support the Assad regime. They do not apply to humanitarian aid or assistance. And so that's something that I don't see changing, because if you continue to sanction the Assad regime and the supporters of the Assad regime, then you prevent certain things from happening inside the country that are detrimental often or harmful to many of the Syrian citizens and Syrian people that are living in non-regime controlled areas or opposition controlled areas, for example, northwest Syria. So I don't think that you'll find a change in overall policy towards the Syrian government anytime soon. But it will always, the sanctions will always be not applied or exempt from humanitarian or for humanitarian assistance.
هل تدفع كارثة الزلزال المجتمع الدولي إلى تذكر الملف السوري الذي بقي دون حلول سياسية كما كان يتحدث المجتمع الدولي؟ يعني اليوم واحدة من أهم المشكلات التي تؤدي إلى تأخير إيصال المساعدات هي ليست فقط العقوبات، ولكن أيضا الصراعات بين السوريين أنفسهم، الصراعات بين السوريين في شمال شرق سوريا، شمال غرب سوريا، المشكلة التركية مع شمال شرق سوريا. هل كل هذه الظروف اليوم ربما تحرك الملف السوري من جديد؟
I think if you look around the world, there are so many things that Western governments are struggling with, not only their own domestic policies, but they're also now completely preoccupied with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and with supporting, the US supporting European allies and dealing with the fallout from that invasion, supporting Ukraine. There's a huge US priority of countering China, or kind of standing up to China and on the international stage. And so there's so much going on in terms of foreign policy priorities for this administration in the US and also for European governments, that unfortunately I think that there won't be that much priority given to political change in Syria. But that doesn't mean that there isn't continued humanitarian and other assistance being applied to those who need it in Syria. For example, in northwest Syria, humanitarian assistance is ongoing. The US is actually the largest humanitarian assistance contributor to relief efforts in Syria. And I think that the US is not going to be too excited about trying to get into changing, trying to change a certain government. Those things are very from the beginning of the Obama administration and Trump and now Biden, they were very clear about the fact that the US was not going to be involved in trying to change governments or change situations on the ground in countries, especially the Middle East, but that they would continue to do two things: apply pressure on the regime by imposing sanctions, and by diplomatic isolation, basically to try to get it to change its behavior, and providing assistance when and how they can to the people who need it the most.
سيدة ياسمين، هل لدى الولايات المتحدة والدول الأوروبية تجارب إيجابية سابقة مع سياسة العقوبات؟ هل أدت سياسة العقوبات إلى تغيير سلوكيات أي أنظمة أو تغيير أنظمة بحد ذاتها حول العالم؟ وما هي البدائل عن العقوبات؟
I think that's a really good question. And it always comes back to this debate about sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Do sanctions work? That's the question that people always ask. Or do they harm the very people that, those governments that are putting the sanctions on are meant to be helping? And the answer is a bit complicated. And I think it depends on a couple of things. One of the things that it depends on is, what is the purpose of the sanctions? Are you doing these sanctions? Are you putting these sanctions on because you're trying to change the government in itself? Is it regime change? Is it something big like that? In which case, the record kind of history shows that sanctions are not good, are not effective at actually bringing down a change in the entire government. However, if the sanctions are very targeted and the purpose is something a bit more specific, like, for example, in hostage release situations, oftentimes we've seen that sanctions against a government to try to get them to do one specific thing are sometimes helpful. Or, for example, in Iran, when President Obama was trying to get Iran to the negotiating table to negotiate the nuclear deal, the sanctions worked in putting enough pressure on Iran to come to the table, but not to change the government. So it really depends on what the sanctions are meant to do, and also what that regime or government that's being sanctioned, how existential their issues are. So for the Bashar al-Assad regime, for example, their survival is an existential question for them. No amount of sanctions is going to get them to deny their own existence or change their own existence or their hold on power. But if it's a matter of getting the Assad regime, for example, to do something, then that's when you start thinking that sanctions could potentially be useful.
نعم، شكرا جزيلا لك السيدة ياسمين جمال، كنت معنا من لندن.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
وفي الختام شكرا لكل من تابع واشنطن أونلاين. ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل. إلى اللقاء.